America is the most medicated country in the world. Yes, according to the Mayo Clinic, nearly 70% of Americans are on at least one prescription drug, and 25% of us are on 5 or more. And while many of these people are legitimately diagnosed with ailments that require prescriptions, an entire industry exists to exploit people's ignorance regarding treatment. But perhaps no disorder is more prevalent and misdiagnosed today than attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, a whopping 6.4 million children aged 17 or under receive a diagnosis at some point in their lives, a whopping 41% increase from the decade prior. 2/3 of those diagnosed are treated with prescriptions of methamphetamine-based Adderall or Ritalin, which could lead to a whole host of other problems like addiction and liver toxification. Well, TV host and former psychotherapist Thom Hartmann, author of multiple books on the subject, concludes that the origin of the condition might be evolutionary and a result of adaptive behavior instead of the stigmatized disease society tells us. So to break it all down, Thom joined me earlier to discuss the 3 characteristics of ADHD and how they fit into his theory of hunter versus farmer.
We humans have, over the 165,000 years of human history, but particularly in the last 10,000 years, we've lived in 2 kinds of worlds. We've lived in hunting-gathering worlds, and we've lived in agricultural worlds. And for a hunter-gatherer, if you're going through the forest looking, or the jungle or whatever it may be, looking for lunch, if you're constantly scanning your environment, looking around, you're more likely to see, you know, hey, there's that rabbit over there that's going to be lunch, or that bear over there that's going to make me its lunch. So this is a survival skill. So that's the hunting-gathering. But in the agricultural world, you know, if you're constantly being distracted, and instead you're supposed to be picking bugs off plants hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month, it doesn't work, right? Or in a classroom, if you're noticing the insect walking across the ceiling instead of listening to the teacher, it doesn't work. So distractibility, number 1, works in the hunter world, doesn't work in the farmer world. Impulsivity, making quick decisions. If you're chasing that rabbit through the woods and a deer comes by, you don't have time to sit down with a pad and a pen and say, let's do a risk-benefit analysis. Let's see, rabbit, less meat, easier to catch. Deer, more meat, hard. By that time, they're both gone, right? You've got to make a decision and, in fact, probably be acting on that decision before you even realize that you've engaged in a cognitive process. And behavior preceding awareness of cognition is literally the psychiatric dictionary definition of impulsivity. It works in the hunting-gathering world. In fact, again, it's a survival skill set. In the farming world, on the other hand, this is the kid who blurts something out before the teacher calls on him. This is the kid who, or the adult for that matter, who is engaging in a behavior without thinking it through, you know, and without going through that whole cognitive process. So in a farming world, ADD doesn't work as much. And then the need for high levels of arousal. In a hunting-gathering world, the person who's going to be the most successful, the most likely to pass along their genes and to succeed, is the person who gets up in the morning and says, you know, it sounds like fun. Let's go out there where there's things that want to eat me as much as I want to eat them and find lunch, right? Whereas the person who's highly risk-averse, who's afraid of taking risks, that person's going to go, wait a minute, there's lions and tigers and bears out there. I'm just going to sit here at the cave and starve. Okay. Now, in a farming world, you wouldn't want somebody who needs stimulation. You'd want somebody who's just perfectly content to sit on the front porch and watch the wheat grow for 7 or 8 weeks before it's time to harvest it. Because if they were easily bored, they'd say, I'm out of here. You know, I'm going to go off to the big city or something. So my suggestion back in 1980, I published the first paper in the Journal of Orthomolecular Psychiatry, and then in 92, I published ADD, A Different Perception, my first book on this, was that these differences were adaptive. I proposed that they were genetic. I proposed that they were probably associated not so much with serotonin, but more with dopamine, one of the neurotransmitters that is associated with arousal and sensory perception. And that in many cases, rather than dealing with these kids or adults with drugs, we could successfully fix their problem by changing their environment, by putting them in an environment that's more like a hunting environment rather than a farming environment, whether it's changing our schools or changing their job.
And Thom, when you first published your paper, it was pretty controversial in the scientific community and the psychiatric community.
Yeah, I got trashed.
Here we are 30 years later, where you actually had your research confirmed that this is actually a genetic trait, and it's not necessarily disease that means that you're broken and you need to be fixed on drugs.
Yeah, Robert Moises, the guy who was the head of the Human Genome Project, went off, after that was done, went off to UC Davis and got a chair and a grant and did this collaborative thing with Yale University and the University of Beijing. And I write about it in my last book on ADD, The Edison Gene. And they pulled blood from several hundred individual groups of people who were identifiably, these people have been hunter-gatherers for 1,000 years, these people have been farmers for 1,000 years. And what they found, and over a large number of them, was that there were these dopamine differences, that they were associated with the dopamine genes, the DTDR genes, dopamine transporter and dopamine receptor genes, and there were certain alleles, these pieces of the genes that flip things on and off, that were on for dopamine in the farmers and were off for dopamine in the hunters, which is exactly what I had suggested. So 2 years ago, one of the larger psychiatric groups published actually an apology to me. Hartmann was right.
Amazing validation. Thom, according to data from the Centers for Disease Control, the number of children diagnosed with ADHD has risen by 42% since 2003. I mean, that's astounding. Now 11% of children aged 4 through 17 are diagnosed with this condition. Why are we seeing such a massive rise? And how do people know, I mean, now that we're out of the hunting and gathering and out of kind of these farmlands and into modern society, how do you know what diagnoses are correct and incorrect?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're seeing the rise because it's become a multi-billion-dollar industry. 2 drugs have been rolled out, relatively newer drugs, since back in the 90s when I was first writing about this stuff. And back then it was a multi-hundred-million-dollar industry. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So you've got, doctors being pushed to diagnose, and you've got, for teachers, it's easier, hey, just medicate the kid. Psychiatrists, psychologists, increasingly insurance companies will only pay for 6 minutes, 10 minutes, 12 minutes. You can't really do, let's work on your life kind of stuff. So I think that the increase in diagnoses is not that we're seeing more people with ADD. There are more people with neurological challenges, and we're seeing that clearly with autism. And I think those are environmental, but I don't think ADD is part of that. Maybe some of the behaviors that look like ADD. But I think mostly it's being driven by this industry. With regard to what we can do about it, we actually still live in a hunting, gathering, and a farming society. As an adult, if I want to have a hunting, gathering world, I become an entrepreneur, which is what I've done all my life. You go on television, you become an investigative reporter, you become a cop, you do some, an EMT, you do something where there's adrenaline and energy and constant change and constant challenge, and every day having to go out of that cave where there's things that want to eat you just as much as you want to eat them, right? On the other hand, if you are the opposite end of ADD, the overfocusing syndrome, which we tend not to diagnose because these are the kids that get lost in class, but some of them have a challenge too. Then you don't want to find yourself in the job of being an investigative reporter. You'd be much better off being a bookkeeper. So there are ways to reinvent our schools to make them more stimulating for ADD kids.
And there has been a misdiagnosis. A 2010 Michigan State University study found that nearly 1 million children are potentially misdiagnosed with ADHD. Let's talk about drugs like Adderall, because anyone who's taken Adderall, of course, in college, staying up to study for finals,
sure,
it's crack. I mean, it really does feel like that. And I'm just wondering, talk about what's in this drug and how you're not saying that no children should be on medication. No. You're just saying let's analyze everyone on a case-by-case basis. Just talk about that.
Sure. First of all, there's a new family of drugs for ADD that are just kind of more sedatives, and some kids are being even put on antipsychotics. I think that's a bad idea, personally, because it just slows them down. The way that the stimulant drugs work, and it started out back in the 1930s. There was a fellow who was marketing his magical mathematics pill to our schools in 1934. Dr. Benning, I think his name was, and it was Benzedrine. And then Dexedrine came along, and then methamphetamine came along. And Adderall is 3 different kinds of it's 2 kinds of methamphetamine plus Dex, and they all dissolve at different rates or are metabolized at different rates. So it has the effect of being time release, but it's basically speed. It's the same stuff that meth addicts are using. And most meth addicts are probably people with ADD who are self-medicating, by the way, which is a whole nother area of conversation. So what happens is, for your viewers who have tried cocaine or meth or Adderall, legally or illegally, is you notice that what these drugs do is they raise the levels of dopamine, which basically turns up the volume control inside your head. Lights are brighter, sounds are louder, sensation is more noticeable. The five senses all turn up. Tastes are actually more vivid. So for somebody who has low levels of dopamine, who would be a hunter-gatherer, who is constantly trying to reach out into the world and be more stimulated, suddenly being chemically stimulated causes them to go, wow, the world is here. I don't have to get my teacher to yell at me to get the adrenaline rush to feel okay. I could just have it. So, now the problem is that there's side effects associated with speed. There's a whole bunch of them. But as you said, I'm not a total opponent of these drugs. I think that we overuse them wildly. But you have to balance, particularly for kids who don't have a choice of trying a different school, and the school that they're in, they're stuck with, or people who have a job and they really just don't have a choice of another job. You have to balance the side effects of the drug versus the side effects of failing and being kicked out of school in the 10th grade. I mean, that can be wildly more destructive than the side effect of taking Adderall. I would, however, say, and this, not like giving medical advice, and I'm a psychotherapist, not a psychiatrist, so I can't give drug medical advice anyway, but I would say that, or I was a psychotherapist, I would say that, start with the gentlest drugs possible. There's the Ritalin, and there's even a variation on Ritalin. It's D-Ritalin. I'm forgetting the brand name off the top of my head. That's far gentler than the amphetamines, or dexedrine, time-release, low-dose dexedrine, rather than Adderall. Adderall is like going after a fly with a 10-gauge shotgun.
It pains me to think of how doctors are treating this, and kind of how just the misconceptions about this disease. Thom, how can we foster this evolutionary trait and not just dope up millions of kids, on this drug?
We have to honor, we have to understand the difference between hunters and farmers and start honoring hunters the way we have historically honored farmers. And once we start doing that, then we can change our institutions, our schools, and our workplaces to ways that help them.
All right, thank you so much, Thom Hartmann. Really appreciate you coming on.
If you're constantly being distracted, and instead you're supposed to be picking bugs off plants hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month, it doesn't work, right? Or in a classroom, if you're noticing the insect walking across the ceiling instead of listening to the teacher, it doesn't work. So distractibility, number one, works in the hunter world, doesn't work in the farmer world. Impulsivity, making quick decisions. If you're chasing that rabbit through the woods and a deer comes by, you don't have time to sit down with a pad and a pen and say, let's do a risk-benefit analysis.
America is the most medicated country in the world. Yes, according to the Mayo Clinic, nearly 70% of Americans are on at least one prescription drug, and 25% of us are on 5 or more. And while many of these people are legitimately diagnosed with ailments that require prescriptions, an entire industry exists to exploit people's ignorance.
In history, but particularly in the last 10,000 years, we've lived in two kinds of worlds. We've lived in hunting-gathering worlds, and we've lived in agricultural worlds. And for a hunter-gatherer, if you're going through the forest looking, or the jungle, or whatever it may be, looking for lunch, if you're constantly scanning your environment, looking around, you're more likely to see, hey, there's that rabbit over there that's going to be lunch, or that bear over there that's going to make me its lunch. So this is a survival skill. So that's the hunting-gathering. But in the agricultural world,
addiction and liver toxification. Well, TV host and former psychotherapist Thom Hartmann, author of multiple books on the subject, concludes that the origin of the condition might be evolutionary and a result of adaptive behavior instead of the stigmatized disease society tells us. So to break it all down, Thom joined me earlier to discuss the 3 characteristics of ADHD and how they fit into his theory of hunter versus farmer.
We humans have, over the 165,000 years of human
regarding treatment. But perhaps no disorder is more prevalent and misdiagnosed today than attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, a whopping 6.4 million children aged 17 or under receive a diagnosis at some point in their lives, a whopping 41% increase from the decade prior. 2/3 of those diagnosed are treated with prescriptions of methamphetamine-based Adderall or Ritalin, which could lead to a whole host of other problems like